What's the like North American Society for Librarians?
Something like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Chris Howard from McGill. Professor Christopher Howard is very well known for his work in metaethics and normative ethics, but I understand now he's branching into the political sphere. We're already, I think I'm running a bit behind, so I'll spare you the anecdote. So would you please join me in welcoming.
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming. I really appreciate it. These are, as was just suggested, brand new ideas, and so I'm super excited for feedback. The talk is about social media platforms and the power that they have over public discussion. The public sphere is currently dominated by a handful of platforms: X, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and Reddit, all built on centralized networks. Centralized networks concentrate decision-making and infrastructure in a single entity that manages user identity, data storage, policy enforcement, and content curation. These platforms have a ton of power over online communication, which is increasingly shaping broader public discourse. But they're controlled by private corporate actors whose primary structural obligation is to shareholders rather than their users or the broader public. Now, one response would be to try to shutter these platforms altogether, but I don't think that that's feasible or desirable, and I'm happy to discuss why later on. Instead, I think we should be trying to establish governance frameworks that preserve the benefits of social platforms, of which there are many, I think, while addressing their main shortfalls. And crucially, as part of this, I think that we ought to be pursuing a scheme where platform power over the public sphere can be exercised with legitimacy. The main thesis of the talk is that the current architecture, corporate-controlled platforms built on centralized networks, precludes the legitimate exercise of platform power. And the same goes for state-controlled platforms built on centralized networks. So in short, operators of platforms built on centralized network architecture can't plausibly exercise their power legitimately, regardless of whether they're corporate or state-controlled. In contrast, I think that operators of platforms built on open, decentralized networks can, in principle, exercise their power legitimately. Decentralized networks distribute control over identity, data, and policy across independently operated nodes or servers that interoperate through open protocols. Okay. I'll unpack all of that in just a bit. The main upshot of the talk is that if we care about the legitimacy of platform power, we should favor migration from centralized networks to decentralized alternatives. So a couple of quick preliminaries. A few things about legitimacy. So the kind of legitimacy that I have in mind is political legitimacy. As I understand it, political legitimacy is a status that confers the standing to exercise governing power in some domain, okay? Specifically to set and enforce norms in that domain. Legitimacy differs from some other nearby concepts in political philosophy. Okay? It's different from proper authority, which creates obligations to obey. Okay? Legitimacy isn't necessarily the source of any such obligation. Okay? It might only amount to something like, as Anna Stills puts it, a liberty to enforce. So legitimate platforms might, and plausibly do, lack the authority to obligate users to obey platform rules. Okay? Instead, they've only got the standing to establish and enforce those rules. Okay? I also follow Stills and others in thinking that legitimacy is different from justice. Okay? So for example, it's possible for an exercise of power to be illegitimate, but just. Okay. So to borrow an example from Stills, if you and I roll up our sleeves and take it upon ourselves to go out and enforce the difference principle, maybe do a little bit of wealth redistribution from the rich to the poor, maybe we're acting justly, but we lack the proper standing to do it. Okay. Likewise, it seems possible for an exercise of power to be legitimate, but not fully just. Okay. It's plausible that legitimacy requires meeting some threshold of minimal justice, but as you can imagine, it's controversial exactly where that threshold is going to lie. And I'm going to stay neutral about that threshold as much as I can. Okay. Second, I'm going to be focusing only on platform legitimacy in this talk. In particular, the legitimacy of platform power over users and thereby public discussion. Everything I say is going to be neutral about what might legitimize the governing power of states over citizens and of other sorts of firms over their workers. Third, following Amanda Green's work on legitimacy, I take the concept of legitimacy to be pretty sparse or thin, putting only relatively weak constraints on its extension. Okay? So, for example, I think that it's a mistake to presuppose that liberal or democratic ideals are built into the very concept of legitimacy, such that it would be straight up incoherent to suggest, for instance, that a regime could be legitimate but undemocratic. Okay. Of course, it might turn out still in practice that any illiberal or undemocratic regime is illegitimate, okay, or that certain types of regime are illegitimate unless liberal and democratic, okay, or maybe liberal rights, democracy, or other sorts of ideals might ultimately contribute to legitimacy without legitimacy conceptually entailing them. Okay. The point is just that we shouldn't presuppose in our theorizing from the outset that the connection between legitimacy and these specific and contested ideals is analytic. Okay. That's a suggestion that I reject. Fourth, and somewhat relatedly, I'm also going to follow Green in assuming that the relevant notion of legitimacy here shouldn't be so demanding as to predict that no regime has ever, in the history of our planet, met the standard for legitimacy. As Green suggests, a conception of legitimacy that's that demanding isn't especially useful, and as she puts it, invites a kind of resignation on the part of political actors. Okay? We should aim for a standard of legitimacy that doesn't suffer from those flaws. Fifth and finally, just to forestall a possible worry, you might doubt that platform power really calls for or could even be a proper object of legitimacy assessment. Okay? After all, platforms don't possess the kinds of coercive apparatus that states, our most powerful governing bodies, typically wield. Okay? So they can't tax or conscript or imprison, for example. And so you might doubt that they ought to be subject to a legitimacy standard. But really, the governing power wielded by social platforms is enormous and pervasive, I think. They decide who can speak and be heard. They design and enforce communication rules. They moderate content. And via these mechanisms, they shape the architecture through which a great deal of contemporary social and political life plays out. Okay. Of course, not every instance of governing power is going to call for justification according to a legitimacy standard, but plausibly when governing power governs especially important goods, questions of legitimacy need to be addressed. Okay. And I'm assuming plausibly, I think that public discussion is among such important goods. But right now, deeply political decisions about that important good are made almost unilaterally by corporate executives whose de facto authority stems from ownership and capital. Okay. And I think that situation should give us real pause. We're increasingly dependent on social platforms as sites of communication and association, but we accept ruling arrangements in those contexts that we would never tolerate in comparable physical contexts like our cities or civic institutions. So the talk's broader aim is really to start to explore how we might improve governance in digital spaces more generally. An important step, I think, is recognizing the need to legitimate the power exercised by platforms that mediate our speech, shape our communities, and structure our access to and experience of the public sphere. Okay. So let me say a little bit more about the mechanisms of platform power. So platforms exercise their power in three main ways. First, they determine platform architecture. Okay. So for example, the systems that govern identity, content creation, and user interaction. So think questions like, can people post videos or text only? Should interaction be limited to likes and replies, or should there be repost and quote functionality too? Okay, those are platform architecture decisions. Okay. Second, platforms enact and enforce safety and moderation policies. Okay. These determine which in-platform behaviors are permissible and how user behavior is policed. And third, they curate content via recommendation systems. Okay. That is, they execute filtering and ranking functions on all content that flows through the platform, amplifying certain communications and diminishing others, and in that way distributing user attention with those choices. Okay. So through these mechanisms, social platforms shape our experience of the digital public sphere and the public sphere more generally, setting and enforcing norms for participation in that sphere. Okay. In short, they exercise a kind of governing power whose full justification, I think, depends on its legitimacy. Okay, so what's a network? Okay. So a network, for our purposes, is a structured system of interconnected individuals, groups, or entities that communicate and share information through a digital platform. Two kinds of networks are going to be important for us. A centralized network is one where relationships and interactions among participants in the network are controlled by a single entity. While the network itself comprises connections among participants, its structure, access, and data are managed through a central point of control, a digital platform. A decentralized network distributes governance and control among multiple participants instead of concentrating it in a single entity. While the degree and mechanisms of decentralization can vary across possible architectures, a decentralized network structure, data, and operational rules are distributed across multiple servers or nodes, with different architectures employing different sorts of governance approaches. Okay. I'll have more to say about that a bit later. The status quo is platforms built on centralized networks. Okay. This centralization, where the network controller and the platform operator are one and the same, presents a serious and I think ultimately insurmountable obstacle to platform legitimacy. My view is that building platforms on top of decentralized networks instead, where control is distributed among different participants with varied interests and aims, eliminates that obstacle and makes way for the possibility of platform legitimacy. Under this alternative scheme, there's a fundamental separation between platform operators on the one hand and network controllers on the other. All right. So to start, let's talk about the illegitimacy of centralized social. So the most dominant platforms built on centralized networks are corporate controlled. Okay? Many corporate platform operators recognize their important role in public discourse. Okay? X, for example, endlessly and repeatedly has branded itself as the global town square. Okay? So they know what business they're in. Okay? So let's run with this analogy of the town square and consider what this means in practice. Okay? So consider town square. Okay? As you enter, you're required to register an account, an identity native to the square, with the corporate entity that governs the interactions that occur within the space. This identity doesn't meaningfully travel with you to other nearby squares. The same goes for your connections and interactions in the square, which are inextricably tied to your square native identity. All communications that transpire within the square are fully actionable only inside that square. Different corners of the square feature different conversations on different topics, upcoming elections, town people gossip, whatever. Automated entities strongly steer you to specifically chosen corners of the square in line with what the governor believes that it knows about your beliefs and interests. Within this highly curated environment, you observe hierarchies of participation. Some people in the square are a lot louder than others, attracting greater attention. Some of the especially loud square goers have been given megaphones by the governors. Others have been intentionally muffled or muted. Okay? Indeed, some participants periodically vanish from the square altogether. Okay? Not great, I think. So what, if anything, might legitimate that kind of power? Okay? The kind of power that's exercised by the town square's government. So in approaching that question, we can consider various familiar accounts of political legitimacy and attempt to apply them here. Okay? But the most prominent views can be set aside pretty quickly, and I'm going to move through them really quickly just for the sake of time. So please feel free to push back on any of this in the Q&A. Okay? So take public reason views. Roughly, to be legitimate, exercises of power have got to be supported by reasons that all reasonable people can be expected to accept, or be such that all reasonable people would converge on the relevant political decisions. Okay? So private corporate platform operators primarily serve shareholder interests in the case of investor-owned corporations, or in the case of nonprofits, particular missions or values. Okay? And so I think that we shouldn't and can't expect the kind of consensus or convergence that public reason views require among a platform's diverse and global user base. And even if corporations were to adopt some kind of constraining structure for the sake of securing that kind of alignment, corporate control is always going to be highly plastic. And so we can't count on those structures stably staying in place. Okay? I think that this is illustrated really nicely, thank you, Sam Altman, with the recent governance reversals at OpenAI. Okay? Democratic participation views of legitimacy that require equal participation fare even worse, I think. Corporate hierarchy rules out equal participation by default. And any democratic mechanisms that corporate controllers might implement could, of course, be revoked by them at will. Okay? And in fact, we saw exactly this with Facebook in the mid-2000s. If you're not familiar with what went on there, I'm happy to elaborate later. So other alternatives like fact-based or correctness views of legitimacy or epistemic views of legitimacy face familiar problems in state contexts, and I think that those problems are even worse in the platform case. So fact-based views of legitimacy say that exercises of power are legitimate insofar as they line up with the objective normative facts about what ought to be done in order to produce just outcomes. Okay? So for example, a utilitarian fact-based view might claim that the legitimacy of governing power depends on whether it conforms with the principle of utility. Okay? Epistemic accounts, on the other hand, ground legitimacy in superior knowledge or competence of the governors. Okay. A problem with fact-based views is that they look less like theories of legitimacy than theories of substantive justification. Okay. Even if an exercise of power conforms to the normative facts or aligns with the normative facts, that doesn't alone explain or otherwise establish the governor's standing to exercise that power in the first place. Okay. The question of what the right political decisions are is distinct from the question of who has the standing to make those decisions. Okay. Epistemic views, on the other hand, risk collapsing legitimacy into epistemic authority, okay, neglecting the plausibly distinct grounds that seem required to fully justify the standing to make political decisions, especially under conditions of pluralism and disagreement. Okay. Applied to corporate social platforms specifically, both approaches look even less promising. Okay. Platform operators lack plausible claims to epistemic authority. Okay, to think of Elon Musk, for example, and their incentives give little reason to expect reliable alignment with what the normative facts require. Okay, even assuming falsely, I think, that sort of alignment could establish legitimacy. Okay. So one view that might seem to have better prospects is a consent-based view of legitimacy, at least if we take platform-user relationships to be voluntary. Okay. And to anticipate, I'm going to argue later that users' actual consent, implied by regular use of a platform and agreement to its terms, can legitimate platforms built on decentralized networks, though other grounds might exist as well. Okay. But consent-based views face serious problems as applied to the case of platforms built on centralized networks. Okay. In short, the network effects that are characteristic of these platforms make user consent basically meaningless. So refusing use of these platforms entails prohibitive social costs. Lock-in through non-portable identities and social connections means that dissent to a platform just serves to exclude you from important parts of public discourse. And I think that these kinds of exit costs undermine the kind of voluntariness that genuine consent requires. Okay. And since those concerns apply to all corporate controlled platforms built on centralized architecture, I think consent-based views can't legitimate the governing power of those platforms. Okay. So I'm going to discuss some other concerns for consent-based views later on in the context of defending their plausibility as applied to platforms built on decentralized networks. But for now, what's important is that combined with the failures of these other accounts, I think the prospects for legitimating corporate controlled platforms on centralized networks seems basically unpromising. Okay. So you might consider state-controlled alternatives. Okay. Assuming that a state is legitimate, maybe it could legitimately exercise governing power over the public sphere by operating social platforms on centralized architecture. Okay. But I don't think so. Okay, so one main problem is boundary mismatch. Okay, legitimate states can legitimately govern their citizens, but that legitimacy doesn't extend to cover the transnational user bases that social platforms tend to serve. Okay. Another serious issue is the risk to civic independence that state-controlled platforms would plausibly pose. Okay. So privately operated platforms are an important check on state power. A healthy public sphere encourages the emergence of civic organization in response to exercises of governing power. And so for that reason, I think the public sphere is less healthy, other things equal, to the extent that it's subject to ultimate editorial and infrastructural state control. Okay. To be clear, I'm not saying that legitimate states should have no role in governing the public sphere or the space of social platforms. They should enact and enforce broad, publicly accountable regulation, I think, ideally through general viewpoint neutral rules, but while refraining from interfering in most platform operational decisions. Okay. For example, like where they have jurisdiction, they should regulate harmful content and conduct, competition and safety, but they should be holding off on dictating choices to do with like platform architecture or content curation. Okay. The core point is really that just swapping out a corporate governor for a state governor in the town square thought experiment looks far from ideal. Okay. So another possibility worth mentioning is that maybe rather than controlling platforms directly, legitimate states could delegate power to some other entity to run platforms built on centralized networks, who could then on that basis exercise their power legitimately. So I'm happy to talk about this in more detail in the Q&A, but for the sake of time and getting to the positive proposal, I'm not going to go into a ton of detail here. Super roughly though, regardless of the type of entity that states might delegate power to, the boundary mismatch problem that I just mentioned is going to apply here as well. And also there are clear, unfortunately very clear in the present moment, worries about the precarity of arm's length state independence and risk of undue state influence on operational decisions. Okay, so there's lots of case studies here. A recent one is the unfortunate case of the Public Broadcasting Corporation in the United States. So like I said, I'm happy to talk more about that later, but the upshot for now is that even the delegation of power to platforms by legitimate states, I think, fails to legitimate the power of those platforms, at least insofar as they operate on centralized architecture. Okay. The broader result is that it's hard to see how platforms built on centralized networks, whether they're corporate or state controlled, could legitimately exercise their governing power. And the core difficulties, I think, stem from the centralized architecture. Whether operated by corporations or states, any platform built on a centralized network imposes lock-in, non-portability of platform identity and relationships, and unilateral, essentially irresistible control, all of which I think underline legitimacy, regardless of who's nominally in charge. All right. Okay. So just argued that operators of social platforms built on centralized networks can't legitimately exercise their governing power. I'm now going to argue that operators of platforms built on decentralized networks can plausibly exercise their power legitimately. So to start, consider our favorite thing, email. Email runs on open protocols, okay. SMTP for sending, IMAP or POP for retrieval. Okay. Many different email clients can send, receive, and manage the same account. Okay. So a Gmail mailbox, for example, is accessible through Google's web app, okay, as well as various third-party clients that support SMTP and IMAP. Okay. This protocol-level interoperability means that you aren't tied to one interface or one way of interacting with your mailbox. If some particular client's design or policies are objectionable, you can switch clients and access the same mailbox with minimal friction. Okay. Also, when you control your own domain, okay, email enables identity portability. So if I own chris@mydomain.com, I can freely switch email providers without changing my email address. Because I control the domain name, I can redirect that address to any provider. Okay. My address remains the same even if I move from Gmail as a provider to Outlook or whatever, any other service. Okay. Both of these features matter deeply, I think. Protocol level interoperability gives you optionality with respect to how you interface with the network. Identity portability lets you choose who governs your communications. Providers, email providers can differ on issues like censorship and surveillance. The ability to migrate across providers gives you meaningful exit power. This structure, among other things, encourages competition. Open protocols let anyone build interoperable clients. Domain owners can switch providers without changing addresses, and that puts pressure on developers or on providers to align themselves with user preferences. But compare centralized social platforms like X. Third parties can't build competing platforms using the same social graph. That is the structured map of connections among participants in a network. And so challengers need to create new separate networks and convince users to abandon existing relationships and channels of information flow. Without identity portability, users of these platforms also face significant lock-in. Migrating means losing your social graph, content history, and accumulated data. A result is that without protocol level interoperability and identity portability, exit power essentially collapses. Users can't escape objectionable policies by switching interfaces. They've got to accept terms or abandon connections and access to content. And they can't migrate identity or social graphs, which again creates significant switching costs that are just compounded by powerful network effects on these platforms. Since dominant platforms collectively shape the public sphere, this means once again that users have got to choose between accepting a platform's policies or just exclusion from important parts of public discourse, leaving them basically no leverage to pressure improvements. Okay. So I think the solution lies in building social platforms on decentralized infrastructure that enables and indeed requires both protocol level interoperability and identity portability. Instead of a handful of platforms, each operating on separate, siloed, centralized networks, we should aspire to a great plurality of platforms built on interconnected networks that are linked by compatible protocols that together constitute a giant open network where anyone is free to build and participate. So this approach is similar in various respects to email's architecture. Users post content to the network via a platform, but due to protocol level interoperability and interoperability at the data layer specifically, that content is in principle accessible via any other platform built on the network. Users also own and control their identities and connections and relationships that constitute their social graph, allowing them to migrate freely across any platform built on the underlying infrastructure. Okay. Two results of this are worth highlighting. So first, enhanced user agency. If you disagree with a platform's policies, content moderation, interface design, or filtering and ranking systems, the levers of its governing power, you can switch costlessly to an alternative that better aligns with your preferences. Okay. The second result is the diminution of platform power. So under this decentralized scheme, platform power is partially transferred to users via the mechanisms I just described, but also diffused among the likely numerous competing platforms that are built on the network. So consider Town Square Star, the happy town square. Okay. As you enter, you present a universal identity that you own and control, one that travels with you across all public squares. That identity can't be revoked, suspended, or manipulated by any single authority. Your relationships, conversations, and interaction history are portable assets that move with you wherever you choose to participate, stored in formats that you control rather than locked in any particular square. Okay. All communications occurring across the entire network of squares remain in principle accessible to you from whichever square you occupy. What and who you encounter within the square remains curated and moderated by the governor of the square that you're in. But if you disagree with how the square operates along any dimension, including those, you can easily migrate to alternatives while maintaining your identity, relationships, and content. Okay. So I think that's a clear improvement. And I'm going to explain how this structure allows for platform legitimacy in just a second. But first, let me say something about possible implementations. Okay? So there are a variety of possible architectures for decentralization. Okay? I'm happy to chat more about this later, but I think that the priority in selecting an architecture should be feasibility and sustainability of both shared data layer interoperability and identity portability. Okay? Whatever architecture best protects those features. Okay? In line with that section, I think that public blockchains are currently preferable among available alternatives. A sufficiently decentralized public blockchain lets users own and control their identities and social graphs, with these assets stored on the network, helping to secure identity portability. Okay. Likewise, in principle, with the scaling of certain protocols, all content that users post via a platform could be stored on a decentralized storage layer and therefore be accessible to any platform that's built on the network. Okay. So I'm not going to go into a ton of detail here because it's like not the right audience, but I am happy to like talk about this in detail in the Q&A. But for those who are unfamiliar, a public blockchain is basically a shared database that's run and verified by lots of independent parties rather than owned by any single platform or server. Okay. Entries in the shared database are timestamped, very difficult to alter after the fact, and publicly readable so that it can function as a neutral public record that no one operator gets to unilaterally rewrite. Okay. So that's why it's attractive here. If identities and posts can be anchored in that shared public record or in a shared storage layer tied to it, then different social platforms can essentially compete as different interfaces to the same underlying data. Okay. This means that you could switch platforms without losing your identity or connections, and content wouldn't be trapped inside or controlled by any single operator system, but instead universally retrievable from that underlying shared record. Okay. Again, super happy to dive into the details later, but for now I just wanted to like indicate, for the purposes of illustration, a decentralized architecture that could actually realize the vision for the decentralized social scheme that I'm suggesting. Okay. Also, I should say that none of the arguments of the talk hinge on which architecture is chosen for decentralization. Any implementation that secures both identity portability and data layer interoperability would be a major improvement over the status quo. I'm very happy to discuss any of the alternatives up on the slide in the Q&A. For what it's worth, I think AT protocol, which underlies Blue Sky, which I'm sure people are familiar with, is probably the second best option. Okay. So supposing that platforms are built on decentralized architecture, what could legitimate the power of their operators? Okay. So there are several accounts that could work here, I think. But the most straightforward and appealing is, in my view, a consent-based account. Okay. So I'm going to say why I think the consent view is plausible and a little bit in defense of it. And then I'm just going to wrap up quickly by indicating a possible alternative. Okay. So to start, none of the objections that block the plausibility of a consent-based view for platforms built on centralized networks likewise block the plausibility of the view for platforms built on decentralized networks. Okay? So consider the problem of costly exit. Exit from a social platform under the proposed scheme is, again, relatively cost-free, since you own and control your identity across platforms, as well as your social graph, and all content accessible on a platform is accessible via any other. You can move seamlessly between platforms without loss. Okay. Likewise, because platforms are built on an open, decentralized network with shared data layer interoperability and identity portability, the network effects that disincentivize building alternative platforms currently are greatly diminished, if not eliminated entirely. Okay? If you think about it, I think that the combination of a lack of identity portability and protocol level interoperability is what is mainly responsible for the powerful networks that we see around social platforms today. Okay. In short, on this alternative, anyone can spin up an alternative platform on the network and make any or all content posted to the network immediately accessible to users. Okay. And so under the scheme that I'm suggesting, I think that we can expect a far greater diversity of platform options, featuring a range of competing architectures, recommendation systems, and moderation policies. Okay. And at least some non-trivial subset of these, I think, is going to mark out a set of reasonable alternatives. Okay. In fact, under this scheme, developers are going to be incentivized to tune platforms to user preferences, given the greater competition that results from ease of exit. Okay, another worry. So in some recent great work on this, Seth Lazar has argued that individual user consent is inadequate to legitimate platform power, insofar as it fails to reflect collective self-determination. Okay, that is the objection. According to Lazar, social platforms help shape the shared terms of our social existence. And that means that users should meaningfully share in setting those terms as a group, rather than being, quote, I love this quote, passive flotsam in the chaotic maelstrom of others' free, isolated individual choices. Okay. Also, Lazar says, when, quote, the function of governing power is to pursue irreducibly social goods, such as the good of healthy public discussion, its legitimacy can't plausibly derive just from individual consent, but should instead be grounded in the support of the group indicated by those goods. Okay. So I have 3 points in response. First, the kind of collective self-determination or collective authorship that Lazar is concerned to advocate for here is clearly a democratic value. And he acknowledges as much. That's not a jab. Of course, like, we love democracy, okay? But suggesting that a consent-based view is ruled out for not accommodating that value is problematic, I think, insofar as it presupposes that legitimacy constitutively involves democratic ideals, okay? Which, as I said at the outset, is at least not plausibly a conceptual truth. So I don't think that the concept of legitimacy itself rules out a consent-based view, or even necessarily favors Lazar's commitments. Okay. Second, I think that Lazar underestimates the resources of consent-based views. And also excellent recent work, Amanda Green argues that consent-based accounts do not have to be understood as giving individual consent pride of place in determining legitimacy. Instead, consent-based views can understand legitimacy as a feature of a regime with respect to its subjects collectively. Okay. So the thought is this: on traditional consent-based views, legitimacy is relativized to individuals. Okay. A regime can be legitimate for one subject, but not for another, if the former consents and the latter doesn't. Okay. But on Green's favorite alternative, legitimacy is instead a function of the proportion of individuals who consent. The greater proportion of consenting individuals, the more legitimate the regime. Okay. And to whatever degree a regime is legitimate, its legitimacy applies equally to all subjects, regardless of whether they've consented in their individual case. Okay. So in that way, on her view, the legitimacy of a regime is determined collectively, rather than by individual choice. And so on this view adapted to platforms, users can together authorize platforms to help shape the terms of their shared social existence. Also, since the influence of a platform tends to scale proportionally with the size of its user base, users can play a role in determining the terms of their shared social existence by consenting or not to particular platforms' conceptions of those terms, manifested in their architecture, content moderation policies, or recommendation algorithms. So I think all that goes some way toward addressing Lazar's concern. Okay? On a Green-style view, legitimacy doesn't derive from the consent of particular individuals, but instead from the group indicated by the goods that the relevant governing power ought to pursue. Okay. To be sure, this is not a democratic way of helping to set the shared terms of our social existence, and it doesn't give users real voice in determining the specifics of those terms, as opposed to selecting from a menu of possible terms that are themselves set by the operators of the platform. Okay? But to my mind, at least, it does much the same work. Okay? In any case, and this is my third point in response, if you think that platform legitimacy does require user voice, then I'll have something for you in just 1 second. One final worry, also voiced by Lazar and others, namely that a platform can realize negative externalities for everyone, all participants in the public sphere, regardless of whether they've consented to the regime in question. And individual consent to a regime can't justify the harms that a regime does to those who don't consent. Okay. So there are a few things to say here. First, I'm happy to admit that regimes legitimated by consent might still realize negative externalities that affect people who don't consent. Okay? But I think that it's sort of hard to see how that could pose a problem for consent-based views specifically. And particularly for consent-based views like Green's, where legitimacy is determined collectively, and legitimate regimes are legitimate for all subjects, regardless of whether they've consented in their particular case. Okay? So for example, even robust democratic participation accounts, okay, can still license legitimate decisions that impose serious foreseeable burdens on dissenters within the demos. Okay? Never mind those outside the demos who are affected but weren't eligible to participate in the process at all. Okay. My own view is that that does not present a real obstacle to legitimacy. Okay. As I said at the outset, I think we ought to aim for a theory of legitimacy that makes legitimacy reasonably attainable. Okay. And that's hard to square with treating a regime as illegitimate whenever it imposes any burdens on dissenters. Okay. Second, and relatedly, we can allow that some negative externalities produced by regime can make particular exercises of power substantively unjustified or unjust while maintaining that they aren't necessarily legitimacy undermining. Okay. So maybe at the extreme, serious sustained or systemic harms do undermine legitimacy, but not every harmful outcome that a regime produces is going to have that sense. Okay. So Lazar identifies 3 central harms associated with platform power: spread of misinformation, harassment or more general abuse, and manipulation that leads to things like radicalization. Okay. While the decentralized scheme that I'm suggesting doesn't eliminate those harms, the greater optionality with respect to platform choice and the meaningful exit power that's afforded by the scheme that I'm suggesting at least gives users more agency to avoid platforms whose governance perpetuates those kinds of harms. Third, and finally, the scheme that I'm proposing in principle distributes platform power across a greater plurality of competing platforms. Okay. And plausibly, that is going to reduce the capacity of any single actor to produce severe harms. Okay. So for example, whereas X alone shapes discourse for hundreds of millions of users, under a decentralized scheme like the one I'm advocating, the most popular platform might influence tens of millions, okay, with dozens of platforms collectively serving the same total user base. Okay. The result is that no single platform could make governance decisions with the same kind of potential for widespread harm as today's dominant platforms. Okay. Even if a particular platform's governance exacerbates misinformation, harassment or abuse or manipulation, the scope of the harm would be structurally limited by the platform's comparably more modest reach. So I think that none of these objections really threaten the plausibility of a consent-based view of legitimacy as applied to platforms built on decentralized networks. And so I think that we should say that these platforms can be legitimate to the extent that we consent to the norms that they set. Okay, so to wrap up, as hinted earlier, I think that while user consent can be sufficient to legitimize platform power on decentralized networks, other accounts might work too. Okay? I see no reason to think that political legitimacy couldn't be multiply realizable, at least in this context, if not more generally. So for example, in the platform case, co-op run platforms, okay, so like membership corporations that are democratically controlled by users could potentially be legitimate through democratic participation, okay, or maybe by the lights of even public reason views. Okay. Without powerful networks that are characteristic of the status quo, small groups could spin up platforms on their own where their governance mechanisms are collectively decided. Okay. I'm more optimistic about consent-based views for a few reasons. Plausibly, not all legitimate platforms need to be co-ops. That's the main reason. I think there can be other structures that could underlie legitimate platforms. And also, democratic participation views of platform legitimacy inherit some of the problems faced by democratic views of state legitimacy, like boundary problems, okay, where people who aren't able to participate in determining the governance structure of the platform because they're not members could still be affected by the democratic decisions of members. Happy to talk more about that in just a second. But for now, I just wanted to highlight in closing that the decentralized scheme that I'm suggesting potentially offers multiple pathways to platform legitimacy. That's it. Thanks.